Good evening, everyone. So great to see a good audience here. I'm honored to be moderating this conversation with two climate champions, Todd Stern and Li Shuo. As Rory just said, Todd was the lead climate negotiator during the pivotal years of the Paris Climate Agreement negotiations, which we'll be talking about tonight. Li Shuo moved to DC this year after more than a decade in Beijing as Greenpeace's global policy advisor, where I think he probably attended nearly as many COPs as Todd Stern did at that time. I think it's safe to say that my speakers this evening would have preferred to be having this conversation under different circumstances, certainly politically. But I think that given the kind of uncertainty of this moment, it's all the more important that we kind of tap into their expertise and talk about how to make sense of this current moment and project ahead. So today's conversation will largely focus on the US-China relationship within the context of Todd's excellent new book. And we'll also talk about what Todd's book has to share in terms of lessons on the art of diplomacy between these two superpowers. Before we dive into the kind of nitty-gritty issues, I wanted to start with a relationship that is at the center of the book, which is the relationship between you and Xie Zhenhua, who's, if you are not familiar with him, China's lead climate negotiator for the better part of 2 decades. So while the US and China are often opposed in negotiations, you two managed to build this very special relationship. So I just wanted to start off by kind of talking about how you two formed that relationship and the significance of it leading up to the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, well, so first of all, thank you to Lili and my colleague up here, Li Shuo, and the Asia Society for having this event and for everybody who dragged themselves out to come here. So Xie Zhenhua is a terrific an interesting guy, a real character, and I met him back in March of 2009, right after the Obama administration had started, and I had come into the government with President Obama. And at that meeting, that very first meeting, I said to him that I thought that he and I should try to make climate change a positive pillar. I think those are the words I used in the U.S.-China relationship, which was not easy back then. I mean, it's not as difficult as it is now, but it was still, one issue after another was fraught. And he didn't say yes or no. He sort of listened. And I think that what happened in that first year is we became quite good friends. I didn't get him to move much off of positions that China had that were problematic for us. But over time, that relationship that we started meant a lot. And can I tell one funny story?
Please do. I think we'd all appreciate that.
So as a sign of the good relationship that we had, I met with him. He and his team were at the State Department in early September of 2009, and he was. We were getting ready to meet in the windowless conference room, where my team and I spent way too much of our time. And but so we were sort of milling around. Everybody was milling around, and I said, before we sit down, I want to tell you a funny story, which is actually a true story, which is that my wife and I were driving our then 9-year-old and 4-year-old. Back from Bethesda, to our house, and we were looking for a place to have lunch, and Zachary, the older boy, was very fixated on wanting to go to a particular place, Panera Bread, and Ben, his little 4-year-old brother, did not want to do that, and so they're going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and Zachary finally says, okay, we won't go to Panera Bread, but then I get to choose where we're going to have dinner. And Ben looks at him, completely straight-faced, says, I agree with you about lunch, but I do not agree about dinner. and I said to my wife, he's getting lessons from Minister Xie. And so I told Xie this story, and he just roared with laughter. And that was indicative of the kind of relationship that we had, but I still couldn't move him off of their posture on two really critical points for us, which ended up, there was a whole story about that in the Copenhagen COP. But anyway, it was a good relationship, and it's still good.
Mm-hmm. Well, I knew the relationship was important, but reading the book, I really realized that it's, kind of the foundation for almost every breakthrough we see in the relationship building up to the Paris Agreement. And Li Shuo, I wanted to get your perspective from the Chinese side on Xie's reputation and his role in those years leading up to Paris in particular.
Sure. Well, I mean, as Todd mentioned, I mean, Xie, of course, is a central figure in China's economic and also climate policy planning. He, belongs to this older generation of Chinese officials. I mean, he was already the #2 guy in China's back then Environmental Bureau in the 1980s. So he really held a rather high position from a long time ago. And one thing that we need to understand about Chinese officials who started their political career as early as back then is that was in the middle of China's reform and opening up. And if you are a senior Chinese official at that time, you're supposed to make bold decisions, right? Because China was back then such a dynamic country. There are a lot of critical decisions, difficult choices to make. So his generation of Chinese officials, they really need to kind of share responsibility and provide leadership. And I think he carried that characteristics further into his role as the Chinese climate envoy. The other thing that is very unique about him is he was China's top climate official from the late 80s to the 90s. And then he was tapped to be the vice minister of China's powerful economic ministry. So he was not just only an environmental official, he also had a huge responsibility when it comes to China's economic planning in the 2000s. Also a period of very dynamic economic growth in China. So he had both the environmental and the economic credential, which I think also helped him to not only understand the issue of climate change, the opportunities and also challenges, but at the same time, having this broad domestic political basis, which he would require, right? To advance China's climate agenda. So I think he's really on top of the personality, a very unique official that belongs to a rather interesting time period of China's recent history.
Yeah. So Todd, I know that you and Xie clashed on many issues over your years working together, but one issue I saw year after year come up within the negotiations was this idea of a firewall between developed and developing countries, which goes back to the very earliest climate negotiations. Basically, the idea is that developed countries should bear the burden of reducing emissions first and foremost, and developing countries can do so voluntarily. And so that was a main topic of these clashes, and it seemed like kind of one of the central goals for the U.S. in these negotiations to try to move away from that framework. So I wanted to get your view on kind of why that was so important to the U.S. at that time.
Well, so you have to go back to a little bit of the prehistory as compared to when we came in 2009. So the U.S. had been part of the negotiation that goes back to 1997 in Kyoto. And to go all the way back for just a minute, the 1992 Framework Convention was the original, it was like the granddaddy climate treaty, and it was understood pretty quickly after that 1992 agreement that while it sets out the sort of the broad scope of what climate change is about, there needed to be an operational agreement that could actually be telling countries what they needed to do and put kind of meat on the bones. And Kyoto was the first of the many failed efforts that countries engaged in, eventually leading up to Paris. But the U.S. at that time, in 1997, agreed to a new agreement which followed a basic paradigm, which was it's going to be legally binding in all respects. So the emission reduction targets that countries were going to make were going to be legally binding. And it had this firewall character, which was that developed countries needed to do everything, developing countries didn't need to do anything except what they chose to do voluntarily. So that was, it was the kind of international agreement that under the U.S. Constitution requires a 2/3 approval under the advice and consent provision of the Constitution. And the notion that we could get 2/3 approval on a climate change issue in the United States Senate was a joke. I mean, that just wasn't going to happen. And so we agreed, the reasons why I won't get into right now, why the U.S. went ahead and did that, but it failed. And when I came in 2009 with Obama, if I had one conviction, it was we're not going to do that again. We're not going to say yes to an agreement that we can't join. And so that meant to me that it had to be the kind of international agreement that doesn't have to go to the Senate. And there's a lot of those. It's not because it's international doesn't mean it automatically goes, but depends on what it says, how it's written, and so forth. So the bindingness of country pledges in terms of what they were going to do was a killer for us. So we couldn't go there. And in addition, the Senate had made clear their view of in effect of the firewall, because back at the time of Kyoto, before Kyoto, in sort of the summer of 1997. There was a Senate resolution saying basically, thou shalt not agree to a new treaty in Kyoto if developing countries, or at least the big ones, aren't part of it. And that passed 95 to nothing, right? So there wasn't much question that was going to be a big issue. So for us, we were never going to get away from the notion that there's a difference between developed and developing countries, because that's built right into the 1992 agreement. And one of the fatal flaws, unfortunately, of that agreement is there's nothing in that agreement that contemplates countries graduating to another level, right? Which is quite typical in international agreements, because you had these two different categories based on economic capacity. And so when you see countries dramatically changing their economic capacity, by rights they should graduate out of that, but it wasn't written that way, and so you can't get it to be that way now. So in any event, we had to not get rid of it, because we weren't going to be able to, but we had to make it not a firewall, but a more sort of gentle curve of difference between developed and developing countries. And eventually, when we get to Paris, you will absolutely see that built into Paris. There is differentiation, but of a much more supple and gradual kind. But the history was a firewall. And the firewall, that's not my term. That's what countries themselves called it.
Right, right. Well, one of my favorite moments in the book is this famous clash at the Copenhagen COP, which is sort of known to be a failure, although you complicate that story. But the scene is, I think, on the penultimate day of that COP, where Obama has arrived and he actually crashes a meeting with the leaders of, I think it's Brazil, China, India, and South Africa. And Li Shuo, I wanted to get your thinking about what happened in that room, because Obama actually gets then Premier Wen Jiabao to make some very important concessions about this firewall and moving away from it. And I think it's been somewhat of a mystery to me and many people as to what motivated China to start to move away from its conviction that it needed to be treated as a developed country first and foremost, and that it wouldn't— A developing country, thank you. Sorry, that would be very different. A developing country first and foremost, and that it wouldn't contemplate any sort of framework in which it was treated otherwise.
So I'm going to give the questions to Li Shuo, but just so you know, the cover of the book is a photograph from from the famous crash
holding
meeting.
it up.
But yeah.
Yeah, well, no, I think, again, I would encourage everyone to read Todd's book, because the answer is actually in the book. I think really the most important takeaway from the Copenhagen 2009 climate summit to China was it was such a big failure in the sense that China suffered a lot of public relations backlash because part of the failure was perceived because of China's stubbornness. Right, China was not willing to move to embrace more international climate responsibility, and that sort of break the whole climate conference. So I think what happened after that conference in 2009 was China went back home and really thought about this. Its role when it comes to international climate diplomacy, when it comes to how much responsibilities it wants to embrace. And I think part of the conclusion after their review is they need to take a more proactive stance. They need to evolve their responsibility, and now to have the same kind of bifurcated developed versus developing country dynamic that Todd just described, and that ultimately really paved the way for two things. One is the very extensive U.S.-China consultation, climate diplomatic engagement all the way from 2010 to 2015, and then secondly the Paris Agreement that we reached in 2015.
Can I just add one little thing? So Wen Jiabao, the premier, was the Chinese lead in Copenhagen, and in that famous crash meeting, there were two main issues that Obama was pressing on, and one was basically that the Chinese needed to agree that they were going to submit their target, whatever it was going to be, to the UN climate body, which is known as UNFCCC, not just put out a press release, and that they were going to have it subject to some kind of transparency regime where they would report on what they were doing. But not just that. It wasn't just that they were going to report, but there would be some kind of external review of what they said. And these were issues I'd been talking and pushing Xie on all year, and he wouldn't budge. And the thing that was, I think, fascinating, and you could sort of see in given Xie's reaction to what happened, that Wen Jiabao made a decision on the spot that clearly went beyond what the Chinese, what the kind of rules were that the Chinese back home had given their people in Copenhagen. And he did that. I think I gave him great credit, because that's the thing that made it possible to get some kind of an outcome. And the interesting the thing that makes it clear that he had gone at some level, if you look at it this way, too far, was that my friend Xie blew up. I mean, he completely blew up in this meeting. He started shouting and gesticulating and pointing at Wen Jiabao and pointing at Obama, and he was just furious and upset because he knew that Wen Jiabao had just gone beyond what the mandate was, the mandate from back home. And Obama, who's, kind of cool hand Luke, I mean, he's always a really cool guy, and he sort of stares at him, and when it's all over, he looks at Wen Jiabao and he says, "What's he saying?" And Wen Jiabao says, "Not important."
It's an incredible interaction. Well, everybody has to read the book for that scene and many others, but
every page of the book is like that.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So Li Shuo, it sounds like from what you were saying, and as well as what Todd just said, that China was motivated in part by not wanting to be seen on the international stage as failing other developing countries and moving towards taking more responsibility. So I think that sets us up for kind of what happens after Copenhagen, moving towards Paris. We have, not just COPs every year, but all of these meetings, all of these dinners where you're meeting with Xie, you're meeting with other countries, trying to build momentum. And it seems to me like the 2014 moment where we have President Obama and President Xi Jinping come together, and they have this extraordinary bilateral climate agreement, which you and Secretary Kerry worked to build, where both countries put forward their climate targets and agree to working together to make the Paris Agreement successful. It seems like that was a just critical moment in building towards Paris. So if you could talk about sort of what that took and how important the U.S.-China relationship was to the ultimate success in Paris.
So I'm going to talk about that. I want to give you one little anecdote before we get there, which I think was actually quite important in our Xia's and my relationship, which is if you go back now to the middle of 2009, and we had started a grouping of countries called the Major Economies Forum, 17 countries, developed and developing, and we would meet. That year we met 6 times. Usually we'd meet 3 or 4 times, and in that first year it included a leaders meeting, and we were doing we were negotiating a declaration that the leaders would all agree to, and it was the day. The meeting was in Italy, and it was the day before the leaders came, and we had to meet at our level, at the Sherpa level, to get this thing done, and. So we were in a big conference room, and she motions me in before it starts into a little side room, and he says, and there's a big push from a bunch of countries, the developed countries in particular, to agree that there would be I think it was a 50% cut in emissions by 2050, which now would seem grossly inadequate, but back then that was a big deal. And she has said to me, "We cannot do this. We cannot agree to this." Because clearly they had done the math and knew what that would mean for China. And I said, this was just a completely on-the-spot reaction, just instinctive reaction. I said, "I won't push you." And the thinking, I mean, again, it was instinctive, but the thinking behind that was, we're not going to win this, because he's not going to do it. And if he's not going to do it, he won't be pushed into it. And I'm going to show him, in effect, that I understand, that I'm listening to him. And he must have brought that up in the course of our 7 years going on up to Paris 7 or 8 times. He would keep going back to that moment. I knew that you listened, and that we had this kind of relationship. So, but to get back to your question, now I've taken us off of where you started. But the 2014. Kerry came in 2013. He was very China-focused. He got a lot going with respect to China right away. He went there, and we set up a U.S.-China joint kind of working group to work on technology issues. And Obama was also got very engaged that year. It was Xi Jinping's first year, and they met at a place called Sunnylands in California. And it was not meant to be a meeting where there were what government people call deliverables, like lots of things, concrete things that were accomplished. But there was one, small one, that got done, and it was on climate change. And so Kerry calls me into his office then in 2014, sitting by the fireplace. He's like petting his dog, and he basically says, "What are we going to do for an encore?" Because we just had a good year, so we got to come up with something big, because that's the way Kerry is, to his credit. So I said, I'll be back tomorrow. Let me talk to my team. And so somebody on the team suggested that we knew that the two leaders were going to be together in Beijing in November. What if the 2 leaders would jointly announce their country targets as part of the Paris, the agreement, which would be 12 months later? And I initially thought, there's no way the Chinese are going to buy that, because the Chinese don't want to alienate their good pals, the Indians and the South Africans, the Brazilians, and many other countries who are more kind of hard line back on that firewall question. But within a minute, I started thinking, except that maybe Xi Jinping will think this is a really good thing for them to do for reasons above and beyond climate change, for the relationship that he was trying to build between China and the U.S. So maybe he will do it, and if he did it, it would be a massive thing with respect to climate change, because once the 2 presidents were going to walk down the aisle together, like figuratively arm in arm, in China, like the Chinese would need to have a successful result the next year in Paris. And I never read the Chinese as feeling in general that they needed to have a success. They needed to not be blamed if there was a failure, but they didn't need to have a success. And this would change the not, don't blame me to, we have to get this done. And sure enough, they did. And that then started a 9-month secret negotiation. And it had to be secret because we couldn't know that we would go ahead with it until we saw what the Chinese numbers were. What is their proposed target going to be? Because if it was weak, we couldn't set up President Obama to basically embrace Xie and walk down the aisle together if it was weak. So we had to wait till deep into the year. So we had to keep the thing secret. Amazingly, it didn't leak. And when it was announced, it was in the climate world absolutely electrifying. I mean, it was front page news all over the world, and it sent a message to countries who, go back all the way back to 1995 when the effort began to try to negotiate this operational agreement, as I was talking about, had seen nothing but failure in the end. Well, we thought we did something, but it failed, or we thought blah, blah, blah. And suddenly all of these countries who hoped it could get done but didn't really believe it, believed it. Because here you've got the two 800-pound gorillas, and their presidents have just said they're gonna do this, and in fact it happened in the Great Hall of the People, a big long red carpet, and they walked down together, and it was a huge moment, and it didn't mean that the Paris would happen, but it was the single biggest impetus to getting Paris done.
So Li Shuo, if I can have you play the difficult role of trying to read Xi Jinping's mind, I would just like to get your perspective on what Todd just laid out there in terms of the Chinese motivation to, again, take that next step and decide to do that joint agreement with Obama and kind of get fully on board with not just being part of the Paris Agreement or dragging their feet to the Paris Agreement, but really leading the effort toward the Paris Agreement. So would you agree with kind of Todd's analysis there?
Sure. I think, I mean, the whole process in the run up to the Paris Agreement, the extensive U.S.-China consultation, but also the Obama storming into this small room of basic countries and having a conversation with Fen Jiabao. I think kind of both cases just kind of highlighted to me one very important lesson that we can learn from the last decade of climate diplomacy, in particular between the U.S. and China, which is very important to get high-level engagement. The involvement of leaders on both sides, because if you can get that, a lot of times the considerations and the dynamics at that level may be quite different, and sometimes in a helpful way compared to the bureaucratic level. And I would say that lesson might be even more relevant these days than even a decade ago. So that's for anyone who is engaged with international climate politics for in the future. I think that's a very important lesson. I think the other thing, just looking back in retrospect, the first half of 2010s. There are a few things domestically in China that I think are important for folks to understand. Number one, well, Todd, you are busy with your Chinese counterpart, Xie Zhenhua. China also suffered from very dramatic domestic environmental problems, the air pollution episodes. Some of you, I see in the audience, actually lived in Beijing, in northern part of China, throughout that time period, and you can tell the environmental crisis in China was real. It was, in fact, visual when we talk about air pollution. So that actually gave Chinese leadership, a lot of reason to move. When it comes to, for example, facing down coal consumption in China's power system. The second thing that happened in the first half of the 2010s was China's economic situation was still very much on the up. Economic growth was quite robust. China weathered through the economic crisis in 2008 and 2009 relatively okay, and also in the early 2010s, China's green economic sectors started to take off. that was when China kind of started to transform its very nascent wind and solar industry into something that is very competitive and starting to contribute to the overall economic growth of the country. And then I think the third thing that happened in that time period was indeed at a very high level within the Chinese political system, there was a strong desire to manage its most important bilateral relationship in the world, which is with the U.S. And there was a very clear intention from the Chinese leadership to use climate change as an issue where they can build trust with their U.S. counterpart, and at the same time demonstrate leadership, collective leadership between the two countries. The last thing that I would say is maybe this is relevant for the current time that we're in. Even with all those favorable conditions, it still took a lot of time. And Todd, you can testify this. I don't know, like in your book, you documented very carefully how many trips you went to Beijing where met your Chinese counterparts elsewhere in the world. It took a lot of time throughout that few years. So the point here is engagement really matters. Countries, leaders need to spend a lot of face time together to build trust, to know each other. And only with that, you could possibly reach some meaningful outcome.
That was an excellent overview. Well, we're short on time tonight, so we're going to have to just jump ahead to the present moment, but we can kind of look backward as we kind of arrive at this current moment. And we have this sobering report every year, the UN Emissions Gap Report, and the latest report found that we're now on track to 2.9 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century. So that is far from the Paris goal of well below 2 degrees, aiming for 1.5. So now, 9 years out from the Paris Agreement, I'd like to hear from both of you how you judge the agreement and the mechanisms that were put in place to try to increase ambition over time. Are those working? And how do you just think about the agreement now looking back?
Yeah, so look, I think that the Paris Agreement has been partly successful and partly not. I think it's a mixed bag. I think that the elements in the Paris Agreement are all there. I think, any number of times you see people writing that, we shouldn't have done it that way, it should have been this way, why don't we start over and do a new one? And I would sort of defy anybody to tell me how that was actually going to get done in a way that, just one other fact here that is relevant, to get a decision made in the UN climate world, you need to have consensus, which means basically of those 195 countries, you need to kind of have all of them, or maybe one or two who say no. So that's hard, right? That's inherently difficult. But I think, look, that Paris is built with it has a structure that works. It has a kind of what people sometimes refer to as the ambition mechanism, which involves 2 5-year cycles. First of all, strong goals with respect to getting emissions down eventually to nothing and limiting the temperature as you just described, Lili. So you've got those goals. You've got these 2 5-year cycles. Every 5 years, countries are supposed to re-up whatever their earlier emission pledge was. And to make it stronger and to make it at their highest level of ambition, as the words from the agreement. And so that's all good and strong. I think that Paris had an immediate impact. The fact of getting the Paris Agreement done, the fact of the sort of the message that went out to the world, to citizens, to countries, to boardrooms, that the leaders of the world were finally like grabbing this issue and going to try to wrestle it to the ground. That all helped a lot. I mean, if you look at what's happened in the last 10 years, you will see both that the impacts of climate change are coming at us faster and stronger than the best scientists had realized. That's the downside. The upside is that the progress on green technology has been absolutely spectacular. And it's not all because of Paris, but Paris was a very important instrument in sort of helping to spur that. I think Paris has also had the flexibility, the way that the country members of the Paris Agreement have acted. There's been flexibility in moving beyond what was actually in the Paris Agreement in response to new science. So in the Paris Agreement itself, there is a call to essentially get to what we would call now net zero emissions in the second half of the century. That's what Paris said in 2015. By 2018, there was a new report, big report called the 1.5 report by the climate body, the UN's climate body, the IPCC, called for by the Paris Agreement, by the way, that started to really change people's mind about what the goal should be. And so by maybe 2 or 3 years, 3 or 4 years ago, you saw at the COP in Glasgow, and then the COPs that have happened after that, you now have that second half of the century has become mid-century and then 2050. And countries could have said, well, we're not going to do that because that's not what it says in the agreement, but they didn't. And I think that's actually quite a good sign. The downside, of course, is stems from what you just said in terms of emissions. I mean, emissions are continuing to go up. They're not getting contained quickly enough. And I think that you have a phenomenon which was very much on display in Baku of any number of countries, and I think China is actually one of these countries, that is more concerned about making sure that they don't have expectations put on their head to do things they might not want to do than they are concerned with what is needed to be done to preserve a livable world. And that's a huge challenge. And China is the best country in the world with respect to the creation and production of renewable energy, and electric vehicles and solar and wind and batteries and whatnot, all great. But just to give an illustration, there was a very important sentence in the COP last year in Dubai, which talked about the need to. This was part of that second one of those 5-year cycles I was talking about. It's called the global stocktake. The point is to look at how the world is doing in the aggregate, not just country by country. And in the negotiation in Dubai, there was a crucial paragraph that talked about transitioning away from fossil fuels, those are the words, in a manner that is essentially consistent with our goals for 2050, which are very strong goals, net zero emissions and holding temperatures close to 1.5, at least well below 2 degrees centigrade. And so a critical line. And there was backlash to that all year long, and there was backlash against that in Baku. And the strongest part of the backlash was Saudi Arabia, but also China. And because they didn't want that expectation put on their heads. But unless we do that kind of thing, we're not going to get to where we need to go. So I don't think that the answer is throw out Paris, let's do something different. You need Paris. I would say that there could be and should be a lot of activities that happen with these 20 countries in the G20. They can do hugely important things. I think they are in the course of doing, in the process of doing some important things with respect to climate finance, which is a key, I actually think the key issue right now. But anyway, I don't want to filibuster here, but that's, I think it's not a question of getting rid of Paris. You need some outside activities with smaller groups of countries that can report back into Paris, but you're not going to get anywhere if you try to start over.
Well, I just wanted to kind of stick with the negotiations for a moment, because you both just returned from Baku, the latest round of the UN COPs, UNFCCC COPs, and it was a very contentious COP. I wasn't there, but it sounded like, there was a lot of kind of last-minute negotiation, and finally a climate finance deal did emerge from the COP, which was notable given, the Trump election and what could have happened.
With a lot of help from China, by the way. Yeah.
And that's right. So, Li Shuo, I just wanted to ask you about kind of what Todd just said in terms of China's position in the last couple of years of these COPs, and how you read the signals where you see on one hand China pushing back against some strong language, but also supporting deals like the one that was done in November.
Sure, Lili. I think just to tie your question to the last one, what we can learn from the Paris Agreement. Is the Paris Agreement, are the lessons still relevant? I guess one way to look at the recently concluded COP29 in Baku was this was very much still the evolvement of the Paris Agreement. Just to give everybody a quick idea, the most important and contentious issue that countries need to resolve in Baku 2 weeks ago was climate finance. Namely, how much climate finance and support some of the most vulnerable countries in the world should receive from kind of industrialized countries, but also other rich countries. The outcome that we got was that developed countries will still play a leading role in providing those climate finance and support to developing countries. But at the same time, countries like China will also play a larger role. Will voluntarily continue, its South-South climate cooperation, but also, we will count some of the contributions from China to multilateral development banks. So that's an important step. Again, if you look at this from the point of view of the Paris Agreement, the deal that was reached in Baku was very much an extension of a very important DNA that was embedded in the Paris Agreement, which is countries will constantly evolve their responsibility. They will try to do more over time. And that's really the beauty and the source of resilience of this agreement. And I would also say the other thing that really stood out very strongly from the recent COP is coordination amongst some of the largest emitters and economies. That still matters a great deal. We saw still a lot of U.S.-China climate engagement at this COP, even with the recent election outcome here in the U.S. The final deal also had quite a strong fingerprint from both the U.S. and China. And of course, in Baku, we also saw the EU-China climate engagement also played a very important role, helped very much stabilize multilateral climate talks. So, yeah. So
I'm sure everybody is going to be asking and wondering about the Trump question going forward now. Trump, as I said, has threatened once again to withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Agreement. So assuming that does happen, the U.S. will not be playing that role of, pushing things forward, pushing the ambition. Li Shuo, you just mentioned China and the EU collaborating at this recent COP. And we're also in this critical 5-year cycle that Todd just mentioned, in which all countries have to submit their new targets, this time all the way out to 2035, which is a critical kind of halfway point on the way to net zero emissions in 2050. So I'm curious, from what you were hearing in Baku, first of all, how countries are responding to the Trump election in terms of the ambition of those new nationally determined contributions, those targets. And then if we can also talk about what climate diplomacy might look like in these coming years without the U.S. kind of at the center. So
I'll talk about Trump in just a second. The new targets, the NDCs, as Lili was just saying, are super important, and again, as Lili said, they go out to 2035, and the reason that's important is that by the time you get to 2035, you're only 15 years away from mid-century. So if you think you're going to be able to make your goals, but you're nowhere near on target in 2035, you're not going to make your goals, and that's kind of hugely important. China right now is a third of all global emissions, and is larger than all the developed countries in the world put together in terms of their emissions. And experts, including the Asia Society, have said that what China should be doing in order to give us a chance to be where we need to be, they're pretty much peaking their emissions right now, like going up, and now they're sort of at a peak, is to reduce the emissions compared to the peak by about 30%. I think we're going to see nothing close to that. I hope I'm wrong, but it doesn't feel that way. So that's going to be very important. In terms of Trump, look, I would be shocked if Trump doesn't pull us out of Paris again. I don't think you'll have any positive climate engagement coming from the national government. But I think you'll have tons of climate activity and action throughout the U.S. economy and among people and leaders in many parts of the country. So you have some of these organizations came to life in 2017, right after Trump pulled out the first time. You have organizations like the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is the governors of I think at this point it's 24, 25 states that collaborate on actions that they can take at the subnational level. You've got a big conference of mayors that do the same thing. You have, I'm wearing a little button that says America is all in. That's a merger of two organizations that sprung up overnight when Trump did this the first time. You will have, and you will have in spades the machinery of energy of green energy development is gonna keep going on because they can't afford to stop. They're in a global economy. Companies that are developers and researchers and car companies and startups, they're all going to be pounding forward on the green transition because if they don't, they're going to lose any chance to have market share. So that's going to keep happening. And so there's going to be a lot that is going on that's very positive in the United States, but it makes a hell of a big difference to not have leadership at the national presidential level, and we're just not going to. So I mean, we can cry about it, but we're not going to. What we have to do is move in all of those other ways as intensely and effectively as we can.
So Li Shuo, if you're China and you're seeing kind of the election results, you've already been kind of mapping out what potential NDC Paris target pathways are for 2035. Do you reevaluate? Do you think this causes China to think differently about where to set that target?
Well, I mean, I think, well, first of all, our overall observation from the recent UN climate summit is I felt there was both a very healthy degree of resilience in the system, but also at the same time, I think there was a real realization from the global community that going into 2025, international climate forces will suffer from a lot of uncertainties and potentially challenges. So that's just the overall sense from the most recently concluded COP. I think on the resilience side, as Todd mentioned, really the economic logic of embracing, low carbon technologies, the fact that a lot of the low carbon technologies, wind, solar, electric vehicles, the cost has become, has declined so much over recent years. Those are really independent from national and international politics. I think that will, that's one big factor that will give global climate action resilience over the coming years. In fact, I personally think the economic factors will be the most important factor that we could rely on in the next few years, more so than the politics. But on the uncertainty or challenges side, I also feel a lot of countries are trying to understand the new geopolitical landscape in 2025 in light of the U.S. election outcome. I see some countries may want to be in a bit of a wait-and-see mode, to understand the Trump administration's early policy in the first couple of months of next year, and that might have inject downward pressure on their climate action. And I think for China, really the most important decision that they need to make is how will their new climate targets look like. And here it's worth mentioning that since the adoption of the Paris Agreement almost 10 years ago, China single-handedly drove 90% of the global emission growth. Right? So there's really no meaningful climate solution if China does not embark on ambitious and fast climate action. So I guess what's in front of China is a lot of geopolitical uncertainty, very turbulent, contentious relationship with the U.S. But at the same time, China has become a superpower when it comes to renewable energy and green technologies. It produces 80% of the global solar panels, 70% of wind turbines, and 60% of electric vehicles. So there are real economic opportunities if China were to double down on climate action. So it's a very complex set of factors in front of China's decision makers, and also the country's global image, I think, is on the line. So I mean, I don't have the red telephone. I don't know how will China make its choice, but I think it is in this very complex set of factors, Chinese leaders will need to take their decision.
Well, I have many more questions for both of you, but I want to make sure we leave a few minutes for audience questions. So I think we have microphones coming around, and I see a few hands already. Let's start. Let's see. I see a hand all the way there in the back by the microphone. If you can introduce yourself and your affiliation, please. Thank you.
I'm Kai. Good to be here. I think one of the interesting things that I think about always is what are the raw materials that are needed to reach a Paris scenario, right? And you're sort of looking at 635 plus mines have to be discovered over the next 25 years in these critical minerals. But conversely, right now, the market for mining, at the very least in commodities, exploration is going down. So the act of trying to find new mines is at record lows, but the demand for new mines that will be needed to power any sort of sustainable future is reaching increasingly higher rates. I'm wondering if there's like anything that could be baked into climate finance stuff. How can we do people think about this, right? Is this a topic that's being thought about in these climate discussions? How can we incentivize mining companies to spend more money to look for new deposits and new resources? Because without that, that's the base of the pyramid, right? So that's the question.
So what I would say is I don't think that kind of thing is talked about very much in the UNFCCC, the Paris, the COP kind of context. I think plenty of people and countries are thinking about that. One of the things that this is just as an example, but we created this thing. I think I mentioned it earlier, the Major Economies Forum. And in my book, one of the things I say is we ought to bring that back and have it focused. Now we're not trying to get a treaty done, but it should focus all on decarbonization. We should come together every year at the leader level once and 2 or 3 meetings leading up to the leader level where we're talking about exactly those kinds of things. But there could be all sorts of other groupings of countries that say we've got to produce more critical minerals and we need to mine more critical minerals and materials to do what we need to do, and there's a shortage, and how do we do this? So I think, yes, there are countries talking about that. I think there are a lot of people focused on that. I don't think it happens, and it probably shouldn't really happen because you won't get anywhere in the context of the COP discussions themselves. But it's an important issue.
Saw another hand here.
Yeah, hi, Tom McHenry. I teach at Pomona College. I teach a course on climate solutions, so this is very timely. I'm wondering about your thoughts about the carbon border adjustment mechanism and the use of trade mechanisms generally to achieve climate solutions, and maybe how that applies to the, of course, U.S.-China and China-global relationship.
Yeah, so I think that the notion of carbon border adjustments, I mean, it's tricky, but I think in general, I'm kind of for it. The idea is, so Europe has, the EU has its own trading system, if you're talking about steel, for example, their companies have to invest in making their steel green or greener and more. And if countries, and whether it's China or India or Indonesia or wherever it might be, are shipping steel in that isn't doing any of those things, then European companies are going to go down. And so having that kind of a mechanism that puts immediate economic pressure on those countries to make their steel as clean as is happening in Europe, I think that's mostly a good thing. It's a little complicated with respect to the United States because the United States the European system is based on there being a local price on carbon, right? And the U.S. Under Biden has done great things. The so-called IRA is a massively impressive and important piece of legislation that's led already to something like $500 billion of clean energy investment. It's great, but it's a theory based on carrots, not sticks, because everybody knows that the sticks won't get through Congress. So, would Europe impose essentially a tax on it? So these are complicated questions, but as a general concept, I think it's a good idea, not a bad idea.
Okay, I think we can take one more question. Let's see, I'm up here at front.
Thank you for speaking with all of us. It's been really informative. I'm Jin Park, and I'm a graduate student at Columbia. My question is sort of in relation to there's like a broader trend of protectionism that we can sort of see, especially with the Trump election.
Yeah.
Given all of that, I'm curious to hear from both of you, where do you see opportunities for the U.S. and China to work together if we get away from the sort of personalities as policy sort of paradigm, and where are the opportunities to continue to collaborate?
Well, look, before you get to Trump, the U.S.-China relationship has been quite fraught and a lot more tense than it ever was before, and for reasons that, I mean, you can like that or not like it. It's not crazy. In my judgment, the posture of the Biden administration toward China has been pretty tough. I think that, and I'm not saying I agree with every element of it, but but it's a different world under Xi Jinping in China than it was previously. So, I think that I think that there are factors that are in play here that are economic, and there's factors that are in play here that are factors of national security. So if you have China, which is unbelievably impressive in the renewable energy, clean energy system that they've built, and they're so impressive and so good that they could probably produce all the green products that are needed for the whole world. But it's a very dangerous thing if you're sitting there in Europe or you're sitting there in the United States to make yourself dependent on one other country. And if anybody needed to see what kind of impact that can have, take a look at the Russian war in Ukraine, and then Russia cutting off the supplies of natural gas to Europe, right? And Europe was completely dependent on Russian natural gas at that point. So the U.S. shouldn't make itself completely dependent. The last country on earth that would ever allow itself to be dependent on somebody else is China. So, but on the other hand, you don't want to slow down the whole system of greening energy all over the world, which happens very successfully through China. So you've got to, these are complicated questions. You're not going to like stop all green production in China, obviously. You're not going to stop having that spread around the world, but you're not going to let it dominate altogether in a way that it significantly has now. And so that has led to tariffs being imposed, both in Europe and in the US, before you got to Trump. Now, Trump is a different character, right? Because Trump doesn't care at all about climate change, but he could have come in with none of those underlying factors and just imposed big tariffs anyway, because that's just the way he operates. But I think even before you get to Trump, this is a complicated question. I mean, Li Shuo, you might have
I would just, building on from what Todd said, I think, going back to your question, what can the two countries do, the U.S. and China? I think the most important thing is to manage this climate trade tension, right? That is increasingly evident, and increasingly, could potentially derail long-term global climate progress. How do you find the right balance, right, between national security considerations, domestic economic considerations, and the need to decarbonize? Can we actually have an honest conversation between the two countries? And I think in this context, maybe the incoming Trump administration will actually provide some political space for the two countries, not at the track 1 level, maybe at the track 2 level, to actually have a more honest conversation. The other thing that I think the two countries can and should do, and again, I don't have a lot of hope for this happening with the Trump administration, but maybe in the future U.S. administration, the two countries still demonstrate collective leadership in multilateral fora. As much as they would disagree with each other in a bilateral setting. I think this is what you documented very well, Todd, in your book. The two countries are fiercely disagreeing with each other, in many occasions. But at the same time, they're bound and they're united by a common mission, right? Which is they need to provide jointly leadership to the rest of the world. I think that's what the two countries can do, and that's something that can be achieved despite of their bilateral differences.
Well, I know both of you have to catch flights tonight, so I think that's a good place to end things for this evening. Please join me in thanking Todd Stern, Li Shuo. Fantastic conversation this evening, and also congratulations to Todd Stern on the publication of this fantastic book. I think it should be required reading for anybody who's interested in climate change, diplomacy, U.S.-China relations, all of that. If you have already purchased a copy of the book, they'll be available. I believe you'll have a few minutes to sign books in the back. If you'd like to purchase a copy, there'll also be a few more that
I'm going to apologize in advance because I usually, write not just my name, but I think given my travel problem tonight, I will probably have to just write a name. But I'll do as much as I can.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody.